everybody, this is John from MTG Nexus coming at you with a quick top 5 decks of the modern format, very tentatively. So this is the post-ban December version of the list. I held off doing the December version because, well, they did announce that a ban was coming. Fury was banned, and Up the Beanstalk was banned, effectively neutering Rakdos Scam for being the top deck of the format, and also knocking off Omnath from potentially taking over the format, though it still has access to the One Ring and can still be a perfectly fine, reasonable deck. So what did that mean? It means Fury is no longer an option for any of the Scam variants. It means that Fury is no longer an option for Team Rhinos. It means Fury is no longer an option for the Omnath decks. It means Fury is no longer an option for Living End. As well as some of the various red mid-range decks that would play it, like Hayashi Red, some other decks like the Belcher Prison deck that would use it as one of its primary ways to wipe the board. Didn't say it killed any of these decks, but it certainly knocked the top deck of the meta, which was roughly about 25-30%, and that was Rakdos Scam. Stepping into Rakdos Scam's immediate Void is a deck that took no hits, and one of its worst cards to play against got bounced. That is Yawgmoth Combo. Now, Yawgmoth is very simple, but also complex. It's a spiritual successor to Kitchen Finks combo decks, to Heliod combo decks. Basically, it is the green creature-based combo deck that has an infinite loop to it that can kill you. That infinite loop usually involves Yawgmoth, and then either the card Yawgmoth, or a copy of Stranglerootgeist, or sometimes Hapatra is thrown into the mix. Either which way, you kind of bounce back and forth with what your Undying creatures, or with Hapatra making snakes and then sacking those. You go find your Blood Artist, drain your opponent out, or you just draw a large number of cards with Yawgmoth in that loop, and kind of take over the game that way. You do have some resilient creatures, Yawgmoth, Stranglerootgeist. You have Grist to play a little bit of a grindy game. You have 4 copies of Yawgmoth. You have Cord, Eldritch Evolution to find all your missing pieces. Some early mana acceleration with Delighted Halfling, Ignoble Hierarch, Wall of Roots. And then Agatha's Soul Cauldron, kind of tying the deck together, allowing you to rebuy any of your important effects. Sideboard, you have a myriad of different answers. You're a toolbox deck. All the other decks I just talked about, decks like Kiki Combo, etc. You basically can chord for any answer, just about anything. Green has a very good toolbox of creatures. You also have things like Haywire, Might, Soulless, Jailer, etc. You have Thoughtseize to disrupt your opponent. Fulminator Mage for the ramp decks. Fatal Push when you need a little bit of help against the aggressive decks. Scavenging Use for any type of graveyard nonsense. Soulless Jailer, kind of very similar things. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. It keeps you from, your opponent being able to cascade into things. Terra Sunder is just a nice catch-all. So this is one of the better decks in the format. I hesitate to say that it's the absolute best, as there are a couple of decks that we'll cover that can contend with this, but it is certainly one of the decks to put up among the most results the first weekend of the post-ban challenges. Second deck is Temur or 4-color Rhinos. You could say this deck did lose something because Fury was a card that this deck would sometimes play, although it does have some decent slots to fill with things like Flame of Anor, Tashana's Tidebinder, and then your Dead Gone, etc., as well as Subtleties. The main thing of this deck, you're trying to cascade with Violent Outburst or Shardless Agent into Crashing Footfalls, putting 8 or 10 power on the battlefield on turn 3, sometimes turn 2 if you have your Gemstone Caverns on the draw. And then you just kind of leverage a nice tempo game with that. Flame of Anor being a new addition to the deck with Mutavault and Tidebinders. Sometimes you can get multiple modes with this card, which it really is annoying for a lot of people because one of the go-to answers for this card or against this deck is Chalice of the Void. It's a shatter effect. Other things that could randomly keep it from hosing, like things like Thalia or Drannith Magistrate, this card also answers. So Flame of Anor quite nicely rounds up this deck's toolkit. I'm not 100% sure what its matchup against decks like Yawgmoth is. I do know it still plays a good bit of removal, so it should still be an okay matchup. And then you look at the sideboard, they've adapted some newer tech in some of the versions. Night Pack Ambusher as another card to kind of play a flash game. This is somewhat similar to the tactic that Living End has developed sometimes. At least a real good grinder from the area I used to live in named Ian Barton used to have a very similar tactic with his Living End deck, where you play like Endurances and Brazen Borrowers and Curator of Mysteries and stuff. So you can kind of play this like flash tempo game, still using things like Fire Ice Dead Gone to keep yourself alive, and then things like Force of Negation and Mystical Dispute to keep yourself alive. So deck is very powerful. It's certainly one of the more beginner-friendly decks in the format, with Scam mostly gone from the format, but remains to be seen whether it be a number 1 deck or if it's going to contend with our third deck on the top 5. Third deck in the top 5. This deck, I think, is the most powerful deck in the modern format. I think one of the tricky things with this deck is it has a bit of a learning curve to play. So it doesn't get picked up by as many people. But when this deck is good, the people that excel at this deck tend to do exceedingly well. Rakdos was a little bit of a tricky matchup somewhat. Murktide can sometimes be tricky. But this deck has game against a lot of the format. And that is Amulet Titan. Now, Amulet Titan is a deck that itself has suffered some bannings. Field of the Dead, Summer Bloom. Trying to think if there's any others that have gotten banned from this deck. But this is a deck that, as long as Amulet of Vigor and Primeval Titan are legal in the format, is going to probably always be a tier player somewhere in the list. Now, it does have things it struggles with, Blood Moon, etc., which the Team of Rhinos decks can adapt when necessary. But I don't know how this deck fares against Yawgmoth exactly, but I do know Dismembers helps in that matchup. Cursed Scroll, card that you're going to see popping up again and again in these sideboards, keeping activated abilities from happening, so card you should be aware of as a Yawgmoth player. But this is one of the decks that I consider probably the top 3, with one more deck that could potentially be a contender in terms of the top decks in the modern format right now. Final deck that I would say is in the tier for the absolute top echelon is Living End. Now, Living End is nothing fancy. It is the sister deck to Rhinos. It's doing something a little bit different. The problem for this deck is it is graveyard dependent, so you're, in addition to being weak to things like Chalice, you're also weak to things like Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, anything like that. Even one-shot graveyard stuff can sometimes be annoying. So this deck is a little bit trickier to navigate than Rhinos. I think Rhinos is a little bit more beginner-friendly. But what this deck does excel at is being very consistent game 1. You have a lot of protection for your combo. You have Grief, Force of Negation to protect your combo, and then you still have the Cascade spells. In the Living End, basically you cycle a bunch of your creatures, put them in the graveyard, cast Living End, wrath your opponent's board, put 15 to 20 power of yourself into play, and then kind of smack your opponent from there. There's a little bit more subtlety to the deck than that, but that's the basic game plan game 1. The dance game 2 and game 3 is which graveyard hates your opponent bringing in, how are you going to play against it, whether it be targeted things like Endurance, counter spells, hate pieces like Chalice, Drain of Magistrate, Leyline of the Void, etc. You kind of have to do the dance of which cards to bring in, which cards to bring out. As a deck I had experimented with a little bit, but I'm still not very good with that dance of the which cards to bring in and out. But this is one of the decks that has also put up a large number of results the first weekend of challenges, minus the Sunday challenge, which the results haven't posted yet, as I'm recording this on a Sunday night. The final deck that I would say is in the top 5 is Murktide. Now, is Murktide for sure back? I don't know. It is a deck that kind of steps into the void of a mid-range deck that's lacking since Scam is gone. Well, Scam is gone, I should say. But still has a lot of the same problems. There's still decks that can go over the top of it. There's still decks that just don't care about what it's doing. But it is a Xerox deck. You do see a bunch of your best cards. But Orcish Bowmasters is still out there. Renin 6 is still out there, making your 1-drops a little bit tenuous. Murktide Region is still a good hammer, but Solitude still exists. There are decks that can outgrind it, whether it be the Omnath piles, Coffers decks, those kind of decks, etc. But it's still a powerful tempo deck, has good cheap counter spells. If you can match your one-mana interaction with your opponent's more expensive spells, this deck can do quite well. And it isn't as quite picked apart as it was during the Grief Fury days. However, I will say this about the format as a whole. A lot of people are still experimenting, and it's still kind of the honeymoon phase right now. People are trying creature decks again to see if they're playable. They're really not. The humans decks, the spirit decks, merfolk to a lesser extent, those decks can be played. I don't know that they'll ever be great in the modern format. Despite Fury being banned, you still have Orcish Bowmasters, you still have Ren and 6, you still have a ton of removal out there. The scam decks, while they have taken a hit, are not completely dead. The reason I say that is, not only have there been one or two scam decks that were trying to do the persist thing with Trumpet and Carnosaur and such, this deck over in Europe in the hands of Mariluz Garcia, she finished first in a larger event over in Barcelona. Basically, Furyless Scam. I think a thing a lot of people discount is Ragavan and Fable are very good Magic cards. This deck is probably the closest thing that Modern has had to a fair mid-range deck, even without Fury in the picture. Like, there were a lot of games, as I was playing Rakdos Scam, as we were jokingly trying to get it banned, they played a very good, fair mid-range deck in the post-war games. So this deck still has the option of double Grief you on turn, or double Thoughtseize you with Grief on turn 1, and can still back it up with a lot of good mid-range cards. Is it as powerful as it was? No. Does it still have almost all the tools that made it powerful with the exception of Fury? Yes. The other thing I will say, the Orzhov Scam decks, which have been popping up here and there. I've played a few different leagues with it now, mostly off the work of Dak Faden. Those decks are still trying to get themselves sorted out. They are a slower mid-range deck, which means they are going to struggle with, decks like Living End and stuff if they find answers to their hate. Now, the positive things with the Orzhov variants is basically the hate cards are awesome. One of the strengths White has had in Modern is the power of their utility. Now, it hasn't been as big a deal in the format, but there was a time where Abzan existed as a mid-range deck almost solely off of the fact that the White Splash gave you access to things like Stony Silence, Rest in Peace, cards like that. But when you compare a fairly okay mid-range deck, you still have the Grief Opening. Stoneforge Mystic can be extremely annoying to deal with. When you pair them with things like Drannith Magistrate and Chalice of the Void, you pair it with things like Temporary Lockdown, along with your Curse Totems. This deck, while its clock is much slower, and I will repeat that, much slower than the old Rakdos Scam lists, it's still a solid mid-range deck that deserves testing and may end up being part of the top 10, top 15 Modern decks. The one thing I will say about this deck is it still dunks on creature decks. I absolutely dismantled a Merfolk deck with Solitude, Ephemerate, and then Ephemerate again, or Orcish Bowmaster, Ephemerate. It's still not a pretty place to be a creature deck unless you have some type of resilience or, some type of backup plan, which both Yawgmoth and Amulet Titan do quite well. But if you're trying to rely on a creature deck like humans or spirits, you really need to load up on things like Unsettled Mariner or ways to get your creatures out of X1 range as quickly as possible and ways to give your creatures ward to make things more taxing. But the problem is that slows you down, so I don't know the creature decks are still in a healthy place. I think they're more playable with Fury on, but I don't know the Fury fixed the problem. Now, that said, this deck could easily one day lose either Orcish Bowmasters or Grief, especially if Rakdos Scam makes a comeback. So be warned if you decide to buy into this deck's hype that you're still not out of the Scam neck of the woods, so a little bit dangerous. But once again, just wanted you to be aware of the decks that are out there, how the format's starting to adapt. And if you like modern content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.